Hi, Eli.
Hey Bob.
How you doing?
I'm a, all things considered, I'm getting by. Obviously I think the world's focus is right now on Israel and Gaza. So
And we're going to talk about that. Let me
yeah.
introduce this first. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Nonzero podcast. I'm the publisher of the Nonzero newsletter on Substack. You're Eli Lake, my longtime ideological nemesis. We every once in a while have a conversation, disagree, and yet remain on more or less civil terms,
For
hoping
sure.
to set
Yeah.
an example for today's youth.
Yes.
Right?
I agree. And
Yeah.
check out my re-education podcast. The latest one is up on the Franz Fanon's long shadow on the current, I guess you could say, anti-colonial discourse that led many on the left
Mm,
to
mm, mm.
rationalize and even celebrate in some cases the horrific barbarism of the October 7 massacre.
Yeah, I listened to some of your podcasts. It's good. It's pretty
Thank you.
highly produced, actually. I was listening to one on the church committee.
Oh, thank you. I put a lot of work into that one. Thanks for
We
listening to
can
that.
talk about that. We'll get around to that. I also
Okay.
listened to your kind of monologue on the situation in the wake of the Hamas attacks, so I think I'm familiar with your views. Now, I'm kind of concerned that we may wind up in a regional war that draws the U.S. in and Iran and places like that. Do you think that's a very likely outcome?
I think it's a possibility. I don't know that I would say likely at this point, but I do think it's a possibility. There certainly has been coordination that we can tell from various meetings of senior Iranians, representatives of Hamas, Hezbollah. Hezbollah has 100,000 missiles pointed at Israel. There has been some they've fired some of them, and the situation is extremely tense. I think that the intention of sending the aircraft carrier, the Gerald Ford, to the Eastern Med was an effort to try to deter Hezbollah, and we'll see if that works.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of a two-edged sword. What I worry about is that it will embolden Israel, so to speak. I'm one difference between us is probably I'm not in favor of ground invasion. In fact, I am in favor of stopping the bombing of Gaza, and you're probably exactly opposite me on both of those.
Well, I kind of I accept the limitations of what I don't know at this point. So it's a mystery as to why this ground invasion hasn't happened. And there are competing explanations, and I would like to find out exactly why it hasn't happened yet. There are Israeli hawks, there are Israeli military IDF generals who I think have said they're not sure that a ground invasion makes sense. I recognize it as a hard choice, but I guess I'm in favor of the outcome of taking out Hamas's leadership at the very least and making sure they don't rule Gaza. And I am open to the means in which to accomplish that. Are you for that on the question of, let's just call it regime change and leave out, the means of regime change just as an end goal for Gaza?
Oh, it would be nice. I mean, there are a lot of cases where I think regime change would be nice, but I think trying to implement it is too problematic for it to be wise to proceed with it.
I think that's where we disagree. I think that Israel doesn't have a choice, and I think ultimately it will be better for Palestinians not to live under the Hamas rule.
Yeah. What? I mean, before we get to the wisdom of that, you were saying there's some uncertainty as to why the invasion hasn't taken place. One thing I've heard recently is that the U.S. is asking Israel to hold off while the U.S. gets certain assets and plans in place. And one interpretation of that is, well, the U.S. is expecting a war. And the other is that the U.S. wants to have a very strong deterrent position, hoping to avoid a wider war. But in any event, what are the
Well, I
other
think, but
theories?
those two are not those are not mutually exclusive explanations, right?
Right. The question is, which one does the U.S. think is more likely, kind of, as it does this? But what other explanations have you heard as to why it's taking so long? I mean, look, it is the kind of thing you would need to plan, right? It's a difficult mission. But
well, for one, what do you do after? So I don't know that the triumvirate that is currently making these decisions in the unity government has a good kind of, well, okay, what happens when we go in and we take out Hamas, then what? I don't think Israel wants to reoccupy and administer Gaza. And that explains, by the way, the strategy of Israel of trying to, they have these sporadic rocket wars that Hamas doesn't do much damage, and then Israel pounds Gaza, and they keep Hamas, what they believed was in a weakened state. Clearly, they were wrong in some ways. So there's, I think, some question about what happens next, and will Israel then be the de facto authority? Can Israel manage to get a credible third party to try to start a transition where there might be, I don't know, if it was up to me, Palestinian elections in Gaza, but if it was just a sort of interim authority until a new Palestinian government can take power, well, it doesn't look like the Arab world and even their new Abraham Accord countries are willing to necessarily do that. Will the U.S. want to do that? I mean, it's unclear who the
I'm
neutral
pretty sure
broker
that the
will
U.S. would not be seen in Gaza as a neutral arbiter as we
Totally
send
fair point.
aircraft carriers in that direction and provide Israel with the ammunition that's killing people in Gaza even as we speak. Now, I'm pretty sure that's not a mission we're well suited for.
I kind of agree with that, but I'm just saying I think that there is this kind of question about, okay, you don't want to be the administrator of Gaza. You don't want to go back and sort of be responsible for picking up the garbage.
Well, this is my question about the wisdom of I mean, I have two questions about it. But that's one is like, I mean, what constitutes the quote elimination of Hamas, and then what comes next, and how does Israel orchestrate what comes next? I don't. You seem to share my uncertainty as to how you fill in those details. I would think that would be good reason to pause and reflect before you do this. And then there's also the fact that I think, the more people in Gaza you kill, the longer it goes on, the more you're ensuring that there will be another generation of people there willing to and even eager to inflict atrocities on Israelis. I think that's the way it works. I'd like to know how many of the people who went into Hamas and committed atrocities, had relatives who had been killed in earlier conflicts with Israel. I just think the thing is it's self-sustaining in that way. And as long as you have that hatred at the grassroots, you can't just magically install a regime on top of it that will neutralize it, and it will find a manifestation. And but that's just me.
Well, I mean, I think that you're getting, I don't know if you're trying to say this, but I think you're getting, close to sort of saying that, the despair and loss felt by Gazans, led to this horrific pogrom. And I would push back on that because I think that, first of all, Gazans suffer under Hamas, which is both corrupt and cruel. But secondly, anybody who was living, in Gaza understands that, forget for a moment this horrific atrocity, which, by the way, they live streamed, so they wanted the world to know. Every time they would launch, I've had, the last time I was in Gaza was 10 years ago, but I remember I wanted to interview people and sort of say, and that what they will tell you, in private, with the understanding that you're not going to be quoting them because they could get in trouble, is that when Hamas starts their wars with Israel, they know that they will be suffering. So there's a natural frustration. We have seen sporadic demonstrations as well against Hamas in Gaza. So I don't want to make I don't profess to have any, and I don't think you can measure this in opinion polls. I've seen some Israelis saying that, the Palestinians in Gaza like Hamas and therefore, screw them or something. But I don't think we can know the answer to that question because there hasn't been an election since 2006, and Hamas rules through intimidation and fear. So that's the first point. And the second point is that how could you have not done this massacre and not expect a massive retaliation? So in my view, like, it's telling that the alleged allies of Hamas in Sydney, Australia, New York City, London, Paris, we've seen these massive demonstrations, are kind of like all celebrating this act of resistance, this jailbreak, as they say. But it's...
No, wait, did you say allies of Hamas?
Well, they claim to be allies
not all
of...
the people at the demonstrations we're seeing in the world are pro-Hamas. The Palestinian flag is not the flag of Hamas. It's also, waved by people in Fatah and so on.
Okay, so these people who claim to be in favor of Palestinian liberation.
Okay.
And these people who claim to be protesting the bombing campaign.
Mm-hmm.
I never hear any one of these speakers or any one of these groups ask the most obvious question: can you return the hostages, all of them? And ask why you did this. I mean, it's not like this is coming out of nowhere. Israel is responding to the worst mass killing of Jews since the Holocaust. And for us to assume that the Gazans do not understand how much peril their putative leaders have placed them in is, I think, is almost a kind of soft bigotry of low expectations.
Well, right, but I mean, I think you have to ask then, why doesn't Hamas get more blowback at the popular level? I mean, you said, am I saying that, the suffering of the Palestinians is the reason this attack was launched? Well, not exactly. I mean, the leaders of Hamas had their motivations, including tactical ones, and I have some guesses about them, including strategic ones. I have some guesses about them, but that's one thing. They wanted to launch the attack. But to do that, they need certain things. First of all, they need a bunch of guys willing to go in there knowing they may well be killed. They need a bunch of guys sufficiently motivated, sufficiently hateful to do that. And I'm saying, yes, that is one product of the way Palestinians have been treated, including in Gaza. And then they also would like to have some degree of popular sympathy. Now, I don't have any clear idea than you do how people in Gaza are feeling right now, and I'm sure no few of them are wishing Hamas had not unleashed this. But still, I would say, as a political matter, Hamas thrives on hatred of Israel, and every Palestinian in Gaza who can say they had a relative or a friend killed by Israel stands a chance of having that kind of hatred toward Israel. And every day now, the number of those Palestinians is growing. That's why I would say I don't think the continued bombing of Gaza is even smart from Israel's point of view.
Okay, so let me push back in a couple ways. So as we know, throughout history, there have been many subjugated peoples, including my people, the Jews, but let's leave the Jews out of it. When blacks were suffering under Jim Crow and lynchings from the KKK, which were colluded with local and state authorities for 100 years after the Civil War, there was never anything comparable to this kind of movement that emerged. Even the black militants that I guess come on the scene originally in the 1920s and then become very big in the 1960s, they talked a kind of game that but there was never anything close to this. If you go to the history of Nelson Mandela's movement against the apartheid regime in South Africa, never did you see anything like this. And it's not like this is the first time Hamas does it. It's what they do. When you mention, like, how did Hamas manage to recruit these martyrs, so to speak, or people who would be going on this kind of suicide mission? Well, I mean, maybe I would look to the curriculum that poisons the mind of everybody who is in a school that is getting money from the UN Refugee and Works UNRWA agency. So there are a lot of other factors, other subjugated peoples. I mean, the Kurds in Turkey launched a kind of campaign against government officials, but I wouldn't compare it to the kind of bloodlust that we saw on October 7. And again, if you just look at all of the history of Hamas and what it's been doing since it was formed in 1987 as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, then this is who they are. And it's, I would say, not in line. I don't think it's necessarily true that people who live under subjugation like this, if they get angry enough, will then become, mass shooters, which is so I push back in that respect.
I mean, yeah,
it takes a little bit more. It takes an ideology. It takes a death cult,
yeah, there is an attendant ideology, but again, it's just going to have an easier time getting roots.
But I would
in certain circumstances than others.
I also want to sort of maybe want to bolster your point, but I also want to say that there is something particular to the Palestinian liberation struggle that goes back before 1948 when the state of Israel was formed, which is that there have been these horrific kinds of episodes, whether we're talking about the Arab Revolt in the 1930s, where there's been almost a kind of strategy where if enough atrocities are caused for Jews living in Israel, then eventually they will feel unsafe enough to leave. And that goes back to Arafat. It goes back, to the groups like the PFLP and so forth.
Eli, the Jews of Israel did the same thing to the Palestinians back in 47, 48. They expelled, most of them were expelled forcibly from their homes, and that included committing massacres in villages and killing 200 people at a shot.
That was part of a war in which the entire Arab world and all of the Arab armies decided to declare war on this new state that was originally accepting a kind of, weird borders that would share the land with the Palestinians according to a UN plan, which was rejected by the Arabs. Now, listen, were there atrocities committed at like Dar Yassin? Of course, there were. This is what happens in war. But was there a strategy of the Jews to just kill as many random Palestinians? That's not true. That's a myth. Whereas I think that when you look at the history of Palestinian terrorism, whether it's Munich, whether it's the Second Intifada, what you see is that their strategy is that they go after the most vulnerable. They go after schools and whatever, and their intention is to make the conditions so terrible that the Jews will go back to where they came from in their diaspora. And it's it's revealing that today we hear so much of the rhetoric of people who are claiming to be in solidarity with the Palestinian cause is borrowed from, the anti-colonialism of someone like Sartre or Frantz Fanon, when it's not true. There is no mother country for Jews in Israel to return to. So I would just say that is a factor as well, which is that part of the history of like this Palestinian movement to kind of have their own state has not been one has been one that is kind of linked together with this idea that you're going to try to kill enough people to make them leave.
Again, if we want to understand why the movement has assumed certain forms, including in the minds of some Palestinians, a desire to evict Jews entirely from the land, which I don't think is an aspiration of everyone by any means, or everyone who marches in these marches or whatever.
Well, hold on, wait. With these marches, they chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That is exactly what that means. It means kick the Jews out of Israel. That's what it means.
Actually, that's not what everybody means by it. And if you ask these students what it means, half of them go, I don't know, it's what everybody else is saying. It sounds kind of innocent superficially, free the Palestinians. Some would say they mean one-state solution, everyone gets to vote. What's wrong with that? Palestinians get to vote. It's one place, and let's see what happens. I mean, I don't think we need to get into a huge argument about what they mean by that. But I will say that I mean, again, the distinctive form that the ideology has taken has something to do with deep historical roots where, in 1920, 90% of Palestine was Arab, and they see themselves having been systematically displaced. We don't need to redo all that. But I do want to say that even if we stipulate that this is, well, I mean, the Hamas attacks were particularly extreme in their violence. Now, and you're noting that there have been other episodes of violence in the Palestinian liberation movement. That's certainly true as well. And
well, I want to say it's not just violence, it's spectacular violence, and it's violence aimed at being a kind of spectacle. And there's a difference between that and, like, listen, it's terrible that innocents die when in these bombings. And I'm not gonna, like, we can acknowledge that that no country is innocent, and Israel is not entirely innocent. So I'm not arguing here that everything Israel does is great and everything Palestinians do is terrible. But I think we have to recognize that this is something that is very deeply rooted in the conception of what it means for being part of Palestinian liberation. Doesn't mean that there haven't been other voices among Palestinians who have questioned this. And sometimes you have people who've been on both sides. Abu Mazen in 2001 and 2002 was a critic of the Second Intifada. And that's one of the reasons why the West wanted him to be the successor to Arafat when he finally died. Now, today, if you listen to Abu Mazen, he doesn't really sound all that different than, the late Sheikh Yassin of Hamas, because this is where the politics are. And if you earlier versions of Abu Mazen, he was, writing his
we should say to people
thesis on Holocaust denial.
Let's just tell people if they don't know, he's head of the Palestinian Authority, also known as Mahmoud Abbas. So let me say a couple of things.
Okay.
First of all, if the question is like, where is their Mandela? If you ask Palestinians that, some of them will say, we've tried, okay? We had, not so long ago, there was a movement of like freedom riders, and they said, let's just call attention to the fact that we're not allowed to ride these buses in the West Bank. We're not allowed to drive on these freeways, let alone like have a vote, get to vote, let alone having due process of the law and getting, as opposed to getting thrown in jail forever with nothing to say about it. Let's just, or actually, let's talk about all that. Let's talk about rights. They will tell you that they've tried to get traction with peaceful demonstrations, and the Israeli government has worked hard to undermine them in various ways. I'm not an expert on that. I will just say that's what they'll say. And related to that is the fact that it's been reported, you may know more than I do, that Bibi Netanyahu has actually had the conscious strategy of keeping the relatively moderate at least compared to Hamas, Palestinian Authority weak, and actually keeping Hamas stronger because the politics work out better for him. Okay, I
know this is what Palestinian activists have.
Well, there are quotes of him. He said things.
Well, I want to get into Netanyahu as well, because I think it's worth talking about that. But to your first point that, they've tried a peaceful strategy. Some maybe have tried peaceful strategies, and I accept that. However, it's always been accompanied by this threat of terrorist violence, and that's just true.
Well, no, not by the same people.
In the height of the Freedom Ride period, there was this thing called the stabbing intifada. I don't know that was a group was responsible.
They weren't the same people.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, well, I don't know. I know what they say is that the Israeli government jails prominent moderates, provokes violence in peaceful demonstrations, and so on. Maybe they're wrong. I know. I know that's what they say.
Prominent moderates.
I was point.
So I was listening to Ezra Klein's podcast with Spencer Ackerman and Peter Beinart. And Peter Beinart, or maybe no, Spencer Ackerman, who mentioned Marwan Barghouti. Marwan Barghouti formed this like Tanzim terrorist militia, and in the Second Intifada was the mastermind of a number of terrorist attacks that killed lots of innocents. And sometimes he's been in Israeli prisons since I think 2003 or 2004. But the point is that that's not a nonviolent leader. That's not a Mandela. I mean, it's important because there have been moments where we know in the Oslo process, for example, Ehud Barak offers probably more than any Israeli leader would ever feel comfortable offering, and that Arafat didn't have a counteroffer, and we know from documentation that was found from his Mukata, his headquarters, that there were plans for the Second Intifada, even as he was negotiating in Camp David. Then moving on, 2005, Ariel Sharon gets out of Gaza, uproots Jewish settlers. The country is somewhat torn apart. And after Hamas takes over, that territory in this formula of land for peace was then became basically a staging area to make war against Israel. Okay, you want to?
I want to just I want to just put aside, put a pin in a broader point that, and then I want to get back to Gaza and the evacuation of the settlers from Gaza. The point I would have put a pin in is like, okay, yeah, resistance movements vary in the degree of violence, the nature of the violence. What happened on October 7th was horrific. Whatever you think is the explanation for what's distinctive about certain elements of the Palestinian resistance, it's what you got. Okay, that is the situation we're dealing with. And the question is, what makes the violence worse? What makes it better? And yes, my view is that if you really want to make things better in the long run, you do need to look at the underlying conditions, the so-called root causes, the way Palestinians are treated in Gaza and the West Bank. And if you don't agree with me that it's horrible and getting worse, I'll have that debate with you. But I just want to say that if you want to say, okay, Palestinians are worse than other people, say it. Whatever they are, they're what we're dealing with. And I think the root causes are something we really need to focus on. And I think the ongoing devastation of Gaza, the ongoing killing of civilians, is making things worse, even from Israel's point of view. Now, on the evacuation from Gaza, I mean, first of all, you're saying we tried land for peace. That wasn't land for peace. They didn't negotiate anything. Let's face it. The main driver was a calculation, a demographic calculation that, given the birth rate of Palestinians and given the possibility that at some point they might all say, hey, why don't you just give us the vote? Israel would be wise to just relinquish responsibility for 1 million or 2 million of them in Gaza and say, that's not part of the Palestinian population. Okay. I don't think you'll deny that was some of the thinking underlying that. In any event, if they had wanted it to be land for peace, they would have negotiated things associated with withdrawal. They didn't. They just got out. And then I want to say one more thing.
But that was 5 years after they did have extensive negotiations of land for peace, and it concluded with a terrorist, uprising known as the Second Intifada.
Well, the Second Intifada was before the withdrawal from Gaza.
I agree. I'm saying there was the Oslo process in the 1990s.
Yep.
At the end of that process, according to Bill Clinton and Dennis Ross and lots of other people who were there, with one exception, Rob Malley, the Israelis kept coming up with these offers, and Arafat not only said no, he didn't have a counteroffer.
Well, if I were
Arafat at the time was we were doing the, you got to deal with the Palestinian you got to deal with who you got, and he was never prepared in the end to make peace. He would rather have been, as I think I said in my my first monologue after the atrocity, that he would rather be the kind of valiant, make this sort of doomed effort of resistance than to be the pragmatic peacemaker. And that's what happened. There's a famous scene that is in Clinton's memoir where Arafat says, "You're a great man." He said, "No, I'm a failure, and you made me a failure." So, that's the context of Sharon's innovation, where he says, "Okay, let's get out of Gaza." He does it. And what was the response? The response was Hamas takes over after winning this election, and then they turn Gaza into basically, a staging ground for various attacks on Israel, culminating in this horrendous atrocity.
Let me say one thing, which is that the episode you're referring to, kind of like the moment when supposedly the Palestinians were offered a two-state solution, and they said no. I think even you may agree that's an oversimplification in the following sense. When we think of a state, a sovereign state, we think of, for example, you get to control your borders. That's fundamental to a sovereign state. It's like you decide who gets to come in, who doesn't get to come in. That's just part of the definitionally true of a state. control your airspace. You can, build up a big military if you want. There's all these things that we think of as being part of a state that just weren't part of what is being offered. Now, you may say, okay, but Arafat didn't counter. I would also say, by the way, that I haven't looked into the details of the proposed land swap, but of course, part of the deal was all this good land where we built settlements, that's still going to be Israel, at least the main big settlements. We'll give you, like shittier land in exchange. But I don't even think the Israelis were offering one-for-one swaps, were they? And maybe you would say, okay, we were waiting for Arafat to counter. On the other hand, that's just so insulting.
I'm saying the deal would have given the Palestinians a piece of Jerusalem. It would have. There were land swaps. I don't know. I mean, listen, neither one of us know all the details.
We don't.
I used to know those details, but my point is that it was probably the best offer that
they were going to get. Yes, that's because America always served, as negotiator Aaron David Miller put it, as Israel's lawyer. And America and Israel had all the power, and we made these shitty offers, and they said no, and then we go, see, there's no pleasing these people.
Well, but I'm sorry, the response to the negotiations, instead of we're going to need more or something like that, was, basically a declaration of terror war. Come on. I mean, like, at a certain point, you gotta blame the Palestinians too.
The main thing I want to say right now is it is commonly said the Palestinians were offered a state and said, no, it's not true. Not what we mean by a state. It's not true.
Okay,
and I'll leave that there.
All right. I mean, I don't know. Like, okay. They would have had almost everything they wanted, including a part of what they call Quds. And yes, you're right. They don't get an air force. They don't get a nuclear program. But baby steps. I don't know what to say.
I mean, part of Jerusalem, yeah. But remember, pre-1967, yeah, they should get a lot. If you're really returning to those borders, that includes all the old city and East Jerusalem, right?
Well, if you want to be technical, then you want to give it back to Jordan and Jordan, Egypt, and Syria. I mean, I don't know. I mean, like, okay, but we're not going to agree. Okay. I think it's important to note that there was, well, I don't know. I mean, it might be worth exploring. Like, I mean, I do think that I mean, I think that it's a bit of a distorted lens because we see, I don't know, we see on social media these clips of people, marching and waving, various kinds of slogans and so forth. But I do think that in the Jewish community, I've heard so many people say that they were like, they thought they had allies on the left and they're rethinking it. There have been some high-level resignations from the Democratic Socialists of America. And to me, I think it's worth pointing out that people who have in recent years said that speakers with whom they disagree on campus made them feel unsafe were extremely, at being as charitable as possible, extremely cavalier as activists in this sort of milieu, to then say this horrendous massacre of, just unbelievable, like almost, it's almost subhuman what was done, is entirely Israel's fault, which was the statement from all those Harvard groups. And it's the language that we heard from a number of different groups. And there is this, like, that, you can find a gazillion professors, it seems, who basically kind of agree, and that the left has found themselves in this weird position of making excuses for this kind of atrocity. Even if you want to remain, I mean, I understand. I'm not putting you in this, Bob. I'm saying there are lots of people who would sort of say, my sympathies are with the Palestinians. I think they've been oppressed. I want them to have a state. Okay, fine. But if that's your position, it's coming from an empathy for the Palestinians, then you should be furious at Hamas. And I'm not seeing any of that. And that's like, I really do think it's revealed a sort of moral bankruptcy from this social justice coalition that wants to tell me that it's like, a kind of violence if I say that men can't give birth, but then we'll turn around and say something unbelievably like lunatic about real world atrocity that happened, it's still hard to process.
No, I am someone who supports, Palestinian liberation, I guess you could call it. I think they should have full political and civil rights in the West Bank. And my first reaction, among my first reactions to this was, this is not good for the Palestinian cause. Certainly not in the short run.
Yeah.
There is that line from the movie Munich, which I'm sure you've seen, where the guy says, you're killing Jews, the world is just going to think you're animals. And the guy says, well, maybe they'll ask what turned us into animals and what our cages are like. Maybe in the long run, this could lead to some sort of larger awareness of the conditions. But my reaction was the one you're talking about. This is not good for the Palestinians. And I don't think Hamas cares about the Palestinians. In general, I don't think political leaders have a tendency to have really care that much about their constituents. But
by the way, we'll find out if it's true. The reporting is still coming in. But if Iran had a role in planning this, then we can say that the Palestinians were pawns of a wider regional war. I can't think of anything like more cynical and like less respecting of Palestinian, sovereignty or whatever than something like that. The idea that if Hamas did this, like, again, we don't know this yet, on instructions from Iran, some people have reported it. Let's just say it's unclear, where it's in flux. But if that's true, that's terrible. It's like, Palestinians are cannon fodder to Ayatollah Khamenei.
Look, I personally think there's no way Hamas salutes and says, yes, sir. If the leadership of Hamas did not see this as being consistent with their interests, there's no way. Given the blowback that's bound to come, there's no way Iran is going to force them to do this. Now, maybe the blowback is more than they anticipated. Some people speculated that the operation succeeded on a scale larger than they anticipated. Who knows? And I certainly think it's possible that Iran was in on it early. And I would further
why did they live stream it?
Look, I have a lot of questions about this. Again, I don't think it was good for the Palestinian people. I will say though that, if they think there's a receptive audience for this anywhere in their constituency, whether it's on the West Bank or in Gaza, and they're anywhere near right, you really should ask yourself, how did things get to this point? Because I don't think Palestinians have some cruelty gene. There must be something in the environment and or history that led to this, and it's worth figuring out. Again, if it is the case that there is very much receptive.
I would note that there was more celebration of this horror in Western cities and other non-Palestinians than there were among Palestinians who have to live in the blast area and deal with the consequences.
I'm not convinced there was much celebration. Obviously, we live in a social media environment where if one professor anywhere says something stupid, everybody's going to see it.
It's not one professor anywhere. When Judith Butler, to her great credit, and I disagree with almost everything she says, this is the same woman, by the way, in 2006 said that Hamas and Hezbollah were part of a global left, which was ridiculous. But she wrote a piece that said in the London Review of Books, no ifs, ands, or buts, full-throated condemnation. This is terrible. And she criticized some of the other voices that had tried to make excuses for it, including these Harvard student groups in that statement. Well, the response of London Review of Books readers was that she was, she had committed an act of treachery against the left and the Palestinian cause. Now, what is that about? That I do think that there's an element here which we got to look at, which is that there were people who were excited by this, that reveled in it.
Sure, there were people. I'm not convinced that there was any great number of them in America. Maybe there were, but the fact that you can, keep bringing up the same Harvard letter and the same three crazy professors forever doesn't convince me. I just don't know. I will say though that, I think it is an important question why Hamas thinks there may be an audience for live streamed atrocities. And the answer is, I think, I mean, if they're right, if there is much wrong, is that once people start hating a group of people sufficiently, there is an appetite for that. And I would say that I'm not hearing much denunciation in Israel of the manifest fact, or even lamentation of the manifest fact that children are being killed in Gaza right now, predictably, by Israeli bombs. And look, I understand that. The Israeli people suffered an atrocity. It's a predictable reaction that they would start lumping all the people in Gaza together and harden their hearts. It's predictable, but there is a reason for it. There is a reason for it. And we always need to ask, what is the reason for the hatred and the hardening of hearts?
Okay. So just a couple points. Okay. One, the IDF does not deliberately go after civilians. Now, you could argue that if they would know that there would be collateral damage given the heaviness of their munitions and so forth. But one of the reasons, at least, for lots of civilian casualties in Gaza is because of the cynicism of Hamas, which is where they place their weapons storages, where they place their rockets, where they place their headquarters, and the fact that they wouldn't let Palestinians leave northern Gaza to go to southern Gaza, and they prevented their population. So they're basically holding that population hostage. So they commit a horrible atrocity. They don't let them leave. They scatter their military operations in densely populated area. So I really have to push back in the one respect, which is that at the very least, that Hamas is a co-author of this misery in this retaliation.
Well,
so that's the first point.
Of course, they're co-authors. Okay. I would say, by the way, I mean, yes, it's bad if they're preventing people from leaving, but for Israel to say, you know, everybody in this big city, if you don't leave, you may die, that's called forced relocation. And by most interpretations, it's a war crime. It's a violation of international law. But go ahead.
I think they weren't saying you have to leave forever. But anyway, the point is that there was an effort to try to warn people, you know, when their bombs were coming and all of this other stuff. Now, you can say not enough. It's the cost is too high. You knew what was going to happen because Hamas, that you know the enemy you're fighting. So even doing that, you knew ahead of time there would be all this collateral damage. And I would say, okay, that is if you want to make that argument, fine. However, don't let Hamas off the hook. If it's the same thing with the fuel and the water. I mean, they take the water pipes that were donated to them by various countries that are looking for development aid in Gaza, and then they turn them into tubes for rockets and missiles. So again, this is the problem. So if you want to talk about root causes, I've got the root cause right now. These people can't be ruling Gaza. Now, going back to our original point,
what kinds of conditions allow extremists to arise?
Okay,
extreme conditions.
I would. Well, no. See, I think that sort of takes it off the hook. That Hamas came out of a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. It was an ideology. It's a very well-developed ideology. They say exactly what they want to do. They want to conquer, in the case of Hamas, what is today Israel, and impose Islamic law. That is what they've been saying. It's what they want to do. And so we have to look at it in that context, as well as the context of, you know, often what has become the sort of, at least a primary tactic throughout Palestinian history, not the only tactic, for achieving their nationalist goals, which is violence against civilians, Jewish civilians. But again, I wanted to say that, like, the Hamas's strategy is to maximize the civilians on their own side. So I turn it around to you. What
maximize the civilian casualties, you mean?
Absolutely. They want dead Palestinians. That's what they want. And so I turn it around to you. What do you do? I mean, what do you do? I mean, and it's not just a pie in the sky, like, yeah, it would be nice. I mean, I think that it is absolutely critical for both Israeli and Palestinian security to get rid of Hamas at this point, because there's no, like, we want to wait for another war where they'll do the same kinds of things. I mean, come on. Well, like, look, there has to be an effort to sort of say no more, and you have to at the very least destroy their leadership. You've got to, like, you know, exile them. You have to basically try to figure out a way to turn them into, like, Abu Nidal Abu
I
Nidal
mean,
was once a menace, and then eventually, over time, he was reduced to living in exile in Iraq. You have to turn them, it's like ISIS had a caliphate, and then
right.
eventually, now they don't. So you
Well,
have to defeat them.
again, if your view is that Hamas is the problem per se, as opposed to, as I would put it, a manifestation of a deeper problem that has to do with longstanding conditions and a lot of historical events, and admittedly is not easy to address satisfactorily. It's a huge challenge in any event. But if your view is like mine, that ultimately you have to address the conditions, then it's just not going to be enough to, quote, eliminate Hamas. You yourself agree that, well, it's not clear what comes after Hamas. Israel can't rule the place. That'll lead to trouble. America can't rule the place. Any obvious proxy regime is in trouble. And if you just sit back and let shit happen, you'll wind up with another Hamas.
Well, I'm saying, yeah, but we have the one right now that committed this horrible atrocity that
Right.
keeps the Palestinians impoverished and immiserated, that poisons the minds of Palestinian children, and that fights wars in such a way that it's a bonus when kids die that they are allegedly protecting. So in that respect, I can't think of much worse. So, but you can't live with them. So it's a hard choice. You don't have great options at this point. But one option cannot be, all right, well, we just have to live with Hamas. That Israel's tried that, and we'll weaken them through these. We'll occasionally take out a leader here or a leader there. They'll do rockets at us, and we'll bomb them, and then it'll be over. And come on, that doesn't work anymore.
Well, I mean, let's talk a little about the Gaza withdrawal, because I think repeatedly the view that I think you're expressing, which is that the problem is always the extremist political leadership itself, as opposed to the conditions that gave rise to it, has led to a ton of mistakes by Israel and America. And let me give you an example of what may be one. We'll never know. But here's what happened with the Gaza withdrawal. Correct me if I'm wrong. You know more than I do. I may get some details wrong, but okay. So Israel evacuates the settlements. I personally think mainly just to change the demographic equation. But in any event, they pulled them out unilaterally. And not that long afterwards, they were going to have elections in Gaza. And America was on board. Israel was on board. George W. Bush enthusiastic, democracy agenda. They said, can Hamas run in the elections? They're like, sure, everybody can run. It's democracy. Democracy's great. Well, Hamas barely won the elections, like 43%, 41%, or whatever. And America and Israel said, no. We said you could run. We didn't say you could win. And so we set about to help their Palestinian rivals overthrow them. And a civil war ensued, and the rest is history. I want to say one more thing. If you go back and look at the videotape right after that election, they were asked, before the U.S. and Israel came in and decided to upset the apple cart or whatever, the Hamas leaders were saying, and we'll never know whether it was sincere, can we have peace with Israel? Yes, we can. We're willing to, let's talk about a long, the term hudna, truce. You go back and look at them, and they were talking very moderate language.
I think hudna has a lot of different interpretations, but okay.
Well, truce is, I mean, you what you mean? It's a pause in a longer war, is what you mean.
Yes, that is traditionally what it means. Yeah.
Okay, fine, but they were saying, well, could it be this long? Could it be that long? Could that long? They're like, yeah. Well, if you have enough time, you can just change the political equation. At least that's my view. Now, I have a particular view of the way these things work, but I will say that was enough. We said you can have an election. They ran, they won. They said we'll be moderate. We said, fuck you. Okay. And we will never know. And the reason we said it, I think, is because of the view you're expressing. No, the problem is the political leadership per se. If we just get rid of the people we don't like, everything will be wonderful. I disagree. I think the way
that's not what I'm
people you don't like is the conditions that Israel never addressed.
Okay, Bob. It was a huge mistake to allow Hamas to run. It was an enormous mistake.
Yeah, apparently.
And, there should have been elections, and Hamas should have been excluded until Hamas disarmed and pledged to join the political process and renounce violence. And
they were saying things like that after they won.
I mean, come on. You're going to believe that this one little blip was this moment when Hamas was moderating? You know the history of the organization. You know what they did, and you know what they were doing. And you know, by the way, we also know that when in the Civil War, when they took over Gaza, they were absolutely brutal to Fatah. And then as soon as they took over, there was no evidence that, I mean, they didn't do anything. I mean, they just started preparing for war. It was almost like it's like it was. I mean,
Well,
like
of
this.
course,
It's a
because Israel and
fantasy that
America
they were
declared war
ever
on
a
them.
moderate force. They were moderating. That's just not what happened.
Eli,
We
Israel and
haven't.
America literally declared war on them through a proxy, Fatah. And of course, they killed a bunch of people in Fatah and were crueler than I would have been. But the point is, we declared war on them after saying, sure, participate in our lovely election.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're. I mean, I'm agreeing with you. They should never have been allowed to run in the election. There should have been a bare minimum that you can't participate in elections if you're also a violent militia and a bunch of terrorists, which we should have done. And it's amazing to me that it wasn't done, and it was a huge mistake. But that it doesn't change the fact that I don't think there was ever a moment when Hamas was moderating. And if I may put this to you, I mean, when you're talking about the conditions in Gaza that, in your view, led people to perhaps, join this terror movement and commit these massacres, um, it isn't the massacre of October 7th like all the proof you would need for why Israel needs to impose border controls on Gaza and check what comes in and out, including people? I mean, isn't that answering the question?
Well, it's like the problem keeps getting worse, and you keep saying, don't we need to be harsher? And I'm saying the harshness is the reason the problem keeps getting worse. It isn't just the blockade per se. It's the fact
Well, it's
that
not. I mean, it's not much of a blockade if they had paragliders and submachine guns and bulletproof vests and bulldozers and all
well,
manner of equipment to pull this off. So
it's a pretty considerable blockade. I mean, their fishing boats can only go out so far from their own coast before they run into Israeli ships and so on. But what I want to say is it isn't just that. It's that Israel has, I mean, in a way, what we're seeing now is a policy of massive retaliation by Israel. Already, they've killed many more Palestinians than died in the initial atrocities. Although I grant you, like Hamas started it, they committed the atrocities. I also grant that Israel is not
they fight in such a way
civilians.
that they endanger their civilian population instead of
right.
Okay.
And I grant Israel's not targeting civilians. On the other hand, they know a number. If they're going to bomb this heavily, they know a bunch of civilians are going to die.
Yes.
After the last huge version of this, Tom Friedman said Israel is sending the message to Hamas that Israel is willing to commit war crimes. He later walked that back, but I think he was right. And so I forget kind of where I was.
Well, I'm just okay. I mean, like, let's talk about war crimes. One party, Israel,
yeah,
it damages them, and that they, I'm not saying, again, no nation is perfect, no nation is innocent, but that's a serious problem for the IDF.
Mhm.
They have a whole division of legal advisors that, look at this all the time. Another party, Hamas, commits war crimes all the time, and it's fantastic. I mean, one way I would sort of describe this is that when Baruch Goldstein shot up a mosque in the West Bank, Israel, the worldwide Jewish community, everybody fortunately, this subhuman animal died in his horrific crime, were disgusted by this, and they denounced it, and this is not who we are. If Baruch Goldstein was a Palestinian who went into a synagogue, in Gaza and Hamas, where there would be murals and he would be treated as a martyr. Now, I'm not arguing that this is a permanent fact of Palestinians or that all Palestinians feel this way. But when the people who are in charge of a territory of land, this is their ideology, this is what they are, this is what they do, you cannot live with them. And the Palestinians can't live with them. So I don't know exactly how you do it in such a way that doesn't, I'm saying, let me put it like this. I know that there will be problems if Israel has to reoccupy Gaza. I know that it's going to be a very hard and knotty problem, but I don't think an option at this point is to just allow these people to continue to rule. And if you want changes to those fundamental conditions, then you have to accept that Hamas cannot be in charge, because it's in their interest. Again, for the immiseration of Palestinians is in the interest of Hamas at this point, we can say. And by the way, I should just say, and I know you probably agree with this, how unbelievably cynical that the leaders of Hamas don't even live in Gaza, and they are cheering on this kind of thing. I mean, it's unbelievable to me that anybody affiliated with Hamas would be allowed to stay in a reputable hotel. I think that Qatar needs to make a very serious decision about continuing to host these people. I think the same is true for Erdogan. But to me, the most villainous characters in all this are the leaders that don't have to suffer any of the consequences of these suicidal actions.
Well, let me before I address that or anything else, let me say, like, we've been talking an hour. Normally, what I do at this point is the paywall comes down, and I say, if you'd like to hear the rest, please become a paid subscriber to the Nonzero newsletter. I'm a little reluctant to do that in a conversation like this, of this nature, about this particular subject. So
Sure.
I defer to you if you'd rather. If you, what do you think we should do? I'm willing to keep the whole thing public. I
Keep
think
the whole thing public. Yeah.
I think it's a useful conversation. I do encourage people to at least subscribe to the Nonzero newsletter and rate and review the
Absolutely.
podcast if you think these conversations are valuable and so on. And of course, smash that like button. And if you want to become a paid subscriber, you'll get a lot of stuff. And be supporting us. But well, okay, you're right. I mean, first of all, that is one of the reasons that the traditional Israeli policy toward Hamas, which is they fire some missiles in, which, by the way, is usually in response to something they consider a provocation, and by historical standards might be considered one. It's like Israel starts breaking what were the traditional rules around the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or inflicts some new kind of indignity or something. But for whatever reason, they fire some missiles. And if there's many of them, Israel responds disproportionately. I did the numbers. In the previous 10 years, the ratio of, in the Israel-Palestine conflict, dead Palestinians to dead Israelis is 19-1. And if you ask why that policy of massive retaliation has not been an effective deterrent, one reason is because the people who decide whether to what Hamas is going to do don't live in Gaza. They're not going to die. And this is a problem with war generally, actually. The people who decide to do it rarely die in it. The other reason it doesn't work, I submit, is because it leads to more hatred of Israel. There's more and more people in Gaza who can say their kin were killed by Israelis. Now, you might say, well, why don't they direct their hatred toward the leadership of Hamas? Probably some do, probably both. Some have it both ways. Those aren't mutually exclusive impulses. Now, I want to say, you mentioned Baruch Goldstein, and you said, well, he's not widely celebrated in Israel. That's true. I mean, I would also say there's typically an asymmetry between the powerful, who the occupiers, the powerful occupiers, and the occupied, in terms of what kinds of tactics they celebrate and so on. There's that. But I also want to add that Israel now has a cabinet member in their cabinet. Who until a couple of years ago had a portrait of Baruch Goldstein on his wall. And then he said, oh, I'm going to get into politics. Maybe I should take this down. But part of the context of this, and let's talk about the West Bank a little, which is not unrelated to this, because, and it gets back to my concerns about what's going to happen, is if there's a ground invasion of Gaza, a lot of shit could go haywire. And part of it is in the West Bank, which is pretty volatile. And it's volatile in part for long-standing historical reasons. Israel builds more and more and more settlements for the last half century. They're violations of international law. They keep doing it. The Palestinians are convinced that they just want to eventually either kick the Palestinians off the land or just declare it an apartheid state or something. And I got to say, that seems to be the way things are headed. But there's a long-standing, there's that, and the fact that they don't get to vote, whereas the Jewish settlers, a quarter mile away on the West Bank do get to vote. They don't get to drive on the nice highways. They don't have due process of law. But what I want to add to that, all that, and I could go on about the kind of specific indignities inflicted on them, is that things are getting worse because the Israeli government is becoming more extremist. The most violent settlers have a growing number of allies in the government. And you're seeing more and more, and of course the violence goes in both directions. Their settlers get attacked, settlers attack. But you're seeing more in the way of, kind of pogrom-like behavior by settlers. and periodically what sounds like the encouragement of that from actual cabinet members, right? And
I
this
think
is,
I am not going to disagree that, and I wrote a column when this happened, that when Netanyahu made an alliance with these far right groups, it was an infamy. I mean, I mean, and I know the history of Likud, and I just point out that it really does mark a sea change. There was a time briefly in the 1980s when Meir Kahane was a member of the Knesset, and when he was, and he would speak, Menachem Begin would leave the chamber out of protest because the Likud party wanted nothing to do with what I would say is Judeo-fascism, because that's what it is. So I really I am troubled by Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. I am troubled by those parties, and I think that I would say, you know, it would be terrible if they continued to gain more popular support. I would note that this government, for a lot of reasons, was before this atrocity, was you know, seeing unprecedented levels of sort of, you know, civic protest, and sometimes a little bit more. I have some mixed feelings on it because I think that the judicial reforms were probably warranted, but I also understand why a lot of Israelis are horrified that people like that would be in their cabinet. So, you know, I mean, and I would say that, you know, there has been, the IDF in part is in the West Bank in order to kind of you know, take action against some of these settler groups that are doing that. I'm glad that you mentioned that the violence does go both ways, because it does. But you're right that that is a kind of problem. But again, what I don't understand, I mean, I don't want to kind of keep harping on this thing that we were talking about with Hamas, but it's like, if that was the condition of Palestinians on the West Bank was gaining a lot of momentum in the West, particularly among young people on college campuses and so forth. This atrocity, the fact that it was recorded, all of that, leave alone the inhumanity of it, it sets back the Palestinian cause, or at least I hope it would, in the sense of, not like I want, but I would like a two-state solution, like I'm sure you would, but I think it really, I think that's why it was so destructive, which is why it was so shocking to see people rationalizing it away and explaining this is what happens. And I'm not saying you were doing that. I think you were making a different kind of argument. So it's not directed at you.
I mean, there's a difference between explaining why something happened and defending it, or
of course,
of
course. I'm not. This is not directed. It was not directed at you. I think we disagree about the extent of the many people in academia who just can manage to sort of figure out a way to explain it away. But you know, you don't get an argument from me. I want nothing to do with people who valorize, you know, mass murdering scum like Baruch Goldstein. And I think it's a reminder, by the way, that, you know, people are not monolithic. And I always try to remind it whenever I do my podcast or anything else like this, that, you know, it's a slur, it's an infamy to claim that Hamas is the voice of Palestinians, because I believe they are not.
Yeah, I agree. I certainly hope they're not. But let me ask you, if the condition in the West Bank is as bad as I describe it and getting worse, and I think it is.
Well, I don't know if we would agree with how bad it is, but okay. Fair enough.
But can I give you one anecdote? I mean, an IDF, a soldier who had done duty in the West Bank, told me about this some years ago. I don't know if it's still going on, but I really think it captures something about the way Palestinians are treated. And I mean, first of all, there's kind of the collective punishment. I don't know how much of this stuff is still going on, where like, because to punish some people in a village, they would go befoul the whole Palestinian village with either actual excrement or something that smells like it. There's like blowing up the home. If there's one terrorist, they blow up the home and punish the siblings. And we've heard about that. I don't know how much of that's still policy. But the anecdote that got my attention, and this is somewhere out there on the internet, this guy explaining to me. You know, he's a member of this group that you're familiar with, Breaking the Silence, these anti-occupation army veterans of Israel who have done duty in the West Bank. He said, you know, sometimes because there are Palestinians who have weapons and planned violence, sometimes the Israeli army has to break in to the homes and you know, do these 3 a.m. raids and so on. And he says, and they have to practice for them. And so how do they practice? What they do is, I don't know if this is still true. It was true as of whatever, 11 years ago when he told me this. They just pick a house. They break in at 3 a.m. They've got guns, like everybody up against the wall, like the 3-year-olds are peeing their pants. They take them outside, they handcuff them, and then they say, okay, we were just kidding. This was just a drill. These are not people suspected of anything. This is just an exercise, okay? And I don't know, you know, when Palestinians say they treat us like animals, I'm not sure I'm aware of anything that comes closer to validating that claim. I mean, that just blows my mind. Even though it's not something that involves killing anybody or physically injuring anybody. You take my point, right? That's an incredible indignity to inflict, right?
Yes, that is an incredible indignity to inflict. And I think that there are many fair criticisms about what it does to the IDF and young soldiers when this happens.
And Palestinians.
Well, sure. I don't know if that continues on to this day. And I also know that there have been much more collaboration in the last 11 years between Palestinian security forces and the IDF, precisely for the reasons that I think we would both agree that, you know, it's not good to have Israeli soldiers keeping the peace in that way and performing this kind of security. Although, you know, the phrase is that, you know, the Palestinian Authority, you know, kind of it protects the area by day and the IDF does it by night or something like that. So I'm sure there are still these kinds of nighttime raids and so forth. And but I also know that there have been efforts to try to do that. And I also know that, like, you know, Netanyahu has tried smaller local levels of kind of economic normalization and removing checkpoints and allowing more work permits and things like that. You know, while he has done nothing really on the sort of peace process. So I take your point there that that kind of thing is something that, you know, a child would never forget. The parent would never forget.
Well, the parent, the humiliated father would never forget. And if you ask him,
I'm agreeing with
and
you.
If you ask, well, how is that going to change their response to any subsequent reports of violence against Israelis? I think I can predict how it's going to change, how the effect it's going to have. It's just a predictable thing about human nature. Except
there hasn't been, not every liberation movement, not every subjugated people, not everybody, you know, it isn't always this case that this happens.
No.
And the Israelis have shown that if there was a peace partner, they are willing to negotiate. Most Israelis still, I think, support a two-state solution. And, you know, it's a question of that. So, I mean, again, I think the Palestinians have been cursed with terrible leadership. I mean, we haven't talked much about Mahmoud Abbas, but he's extremely corrupt.
Yeah, but the U.S. and Israel is fine with that because he's their guy and he'll do what they want.
Okay, so here
they pay
I
him
would
to
agree with a critique of the left, which is that the sort of assumptions of the Oslo process that we can bring in a former terrorist like Arafat and turn him into a statesman not only didn't work, but it was imposing a kind of corruption and cruelty on Palestinians in the process. We were essentially kind of picking their autocratic leaders. And some of that was because some of the leaders of the first Intifada also, you know, had a famous moment where they empowered Arafat to negotiate on their behalf and so forth. But that was a mistake. This was a mistake. And I go back to some of the critiques of the 2000s and 2010s, which is that what's really important is to deal with things like corruption, governance, and so forth, because that also has this effect of not only strengthening the legitimacy of the regime that ultimately will eventually be negotiating peace with the Israelis, but it also goes a long way of convincing Israelis that they have a peace partner. But you have to also, I think, acknowledge that the reason why there isn't a peace camp really right now in Israel is because of, well, I mean, not just this massacre, but it's because the Palestinians continue to think that a strategy of causing atrocities will eventually convince Jews to leave a country as if they were colonialists or settlers, all of them, which is not true. This is the only Jewish state in the world. So I know you might accuse me of being both sidesing it, but I think that's a huge part of that factor.
Wait, say that again. What is the
I'm saying that I don't think that, I mean,
okay,
this idea that we tried peaceful marches in BDS and that's why we had to do the massacre on October 7th, that's not true. There's always been a violent undercurrent in this.
It's certainly not true that Hamas tried the Martin Luther King route. I agree. I think there are people in the West Bank who will say they tried, and I know some.
Okay, fine, but like, why does the Palestinian Authority still pay the families of suicide bombers?
I have long thought that the Palestinians should, in a more thoroughgoing way, embrace just let us vote line. Now, I don't think they'd get a warm reception from Israelis, but it would put Israelis on the spot. And when I was in the West Bank last, which was at least a decade ago, you would ask them this, and some would say, yeah, that's what we should do. Yeah, that's what we are. But some would say, no, then you're normalizing the occupation. In other words, you're subscribing to the system that's oppressing you if you say you just want to be part of it. I don't think that's wise. But that said, I think if there were an effective movement, just kind of give us the vote, Israel would completely freak out and do their best to undermine it. It's not like they would have a partner for peace.
Well, you're talking about a one state solution where.
Well, yeah.
Well,
what else is left? They've taken, the settlements have it's like the West Bank is Swiss cheese. I mean, it's like, they've cut it up into these tiny pieces. Palestinians, they can't go see their cousin in the village a few miles away because there's a highway they're not allowed to drive on in between, because it goes from settlement to settlement. I mean, I have a serious question for you. Even before this last episode, as of September, did you think a two-state solution was possible, realistically? Given Israeli politics, given the situation on the ground in the West Bank, was a two-state solution possible?
I didn't think it was possible in the short term, but I think it's the only solution.
Well, don't you think if Israel really saw it as the only solution, they would quit building settlements? Because everyone makes it less likely to happen, but they keep doing it.
Well, it depends on what you mean. I mean, that's going to take us down a road. I would just say that they have. Do you mean expanding the perimeters of settlements? Because that doesn't happen. What they do is they expand within settlements.
Foundation, whatever.
Some settlements are like these Jewish population centers, which in any kind of final agreement are going to remain part of Israel. And so when you're talking about that, if you're talking about building in East Jerusalem, I don't consider that to be a settlement. So,
I consider that to be important land that is very important to the Palestinians.
All right.
And under international law does not belong to Israel.
I think we're coming to the end.
Okay.
If you want to just briefly say, I just wanted to say I have a long episode called Church and Deep State. It's the final cut. It's the monologue. I also have I broke it up into 2 parts over the summer. I think, especially if you're listening to this and you're saying, oh my God, Eli's still such a bloodthirsty neocon. I actually really do think that I put a lot of work into it, and you might be surprised. You might some of the lefty watchers might find themselves nodding along.
Eli, let me give you some promotional help. I don't think, although you mentioned it at the very beginning, I don't think you just mentioned the name of the podcast, which is The Re-Education.
Correct.
With Eli Lake. And yeah, I started listening to the church thing. It's good. As I said, it's highly produced. Like, who's backing this? Are you getting
it's part of the Nebulous Network, but I do all the work. I find the audio clips. I pick the music. I write the script. I do it all.
It's good. Now, what I want to know is, have you seen Wormwood by the Errol Morris documentary?
I know about it. I haven't seen that, and I'm doing another project right now, which I'll announce probably in a month or so.
Okay, so this is about,
but it will get into MK Ultra, LSD.
Oh man, but
yeah,
the LSD was only the half of it. I mean, that guy was
a lot
flat
more.
out murdered.
Yeah. Oh, Olson, you mean? Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, he was flat out murdered. And well, anyway,
Yeah, no, but
can
anyway,
we agree now? Can we agree now? Because it's the end of this one, and I gotta run,
Yeah.
and I know you gotta run.
yeah,
Can we I would love to do one on this question of like the American deep state. What is it? And I want to do it in part because I think it will be somewhat less contentious, but also because, I mean, part of my motivation here is that people throw that word around and it's often part of a conspiracy theory and it's often not true, but there is such the actual history of the American deep state is scandalous enough in my view, and it's worth looking into, and what it says today and whether we need another kind of church committee.
yeah, that's a fascinating subject. Deep state is an interesting phenomenon. Quick question for you. Am I right in thinking that it originates in the context of Turkish politics? That's the first time I heard it.
No, first of all, you are absolutely correct. It's Turkish politics, and it's in that series of military coups that they have for about 20 years. Sometimes it has been referred to Pakistani and Egyptian politics. Of this idea in the American context comes out of it's the 1950s, and it's specifically like there's an article that is looking at it, and they call it a dual state, where they're looking at the loyalty oaths for people in the nuclear program, the State Department, and then there is a literature that tries to critique it, but the original concept of a deep state is something that applied to Turkey. You are right about that.
Okay. Yeah, that would be fun. Fun conversation. Final burst of promotion. What's your Twitter handle? You're still doing Twitter, right? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I do it more now with all this stuff going on. It's Eli Lake, just
It's
my
at
name.
Eli Lake. I am at Robert Writer, WRIGHTER. Nonzero newsletter, Nonzero podcast, smash the like button, rate and review. Check out Eli's re-education. Thank you, Eli. I do value these conversations. I think we're both arguing in good faith.
Yep.
And
I agree. I appreciate it, Bob. Always a pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Okay. Thanks. Bye-bye.